Black feathers and blood spatters were everywhere on the gray ground. They were the harbingers of someone's end. There was a broken horn lying not far from her, and he stepped beside it with his white boot, not afraid to stain his snow-white clothes with mud and blood. Ides, a demon from the highest demonic tribe of the demon world, was lying on the ground. Only one horn protruded from her head and the other was broken off. Her black hair stuck to the blood that spread on the ground. Her strength was leaving her and she realized that this was the end. She looked at the man who approached her and said that she had lost, and asked that now she would die. Ferdinand, the god of war, stood towering over her. In one hand he held a strand of her black hair, which contrasted with his snow-white clothes, stained in places with blood. He had 2 white wings on his back, and his colorless eyes looked sadly at Ides. He asked why she hesitated at the end. His question brought a sarcastic smile to her lips, and she repeated his question about why she hesitated. And then she said, 120,000 years. Ferdinand reached out his hand towards her scarred body, and clots of white energy began to appear from his hands. Meanwhile, Ides went on to say that for 120 years she had endured all this time and now she was here. He looked at her with his colorless eyes. Ides could not stand it and screamed that he was Ferdinand Habsburgo. He blamed her for not dragging him along. She was overwhelmed with anger and could not contain herself. The white gold glow from his hands reached her body. It was warm and unfamiliar. Her red eyes became glassy and the last thought flashed that this was really the end. That last day flashed through her mind. She was willing to cut her own flesh and blood just to kill him. In the past 120,000 years, she had done many bad things. She had reached the highest position in the demon clan, becoming incredibly powerful. But another scene also arose in her memory. She was sitting at a table in a white palace in a white dress, and across from her sat he, Ferdinand, the god of war. And they were carrying on a conversation, smiling sweetly at each other. Why? Joy, love, these feelings were unknown to her. And in this memory she was exactly in love and happy about it. Why did she remember such a scene? She was on the verge of death, but that was no reason to go mad. And she asked Ferdinand, who was leaning over her, what the hell was he doing? And he said he was giving her another chance. She'd been too focused on getting back at him her whole life, so he'd given her another chance to redeem herself and regain her strength. An energy flowed through her veins that brought her back to life, and she asked what was it? And Ferdinand said that if she did good deeds in the human world for 1 year, she would regain all her powers. He flapped his wings and said one last thing to make her remember. If she attacks anyone or doesn't do good deeds, she will die a painful death. He cupped his hands around her face and pronounced that if she made it through, she would be reborn with holy powers, and he would look forward to the day when she would return to him. Ides gritted her teeth with rage and helplessness. How dare he do this to her, damn man. And she drifted off into the next world, and he sat there staring at her. Seeing his Salie off, he was sure she could handle it. It was the Lucern Empire. People sat in front of the fountain pool and waited. One of them asked His Eminence how long they would wait. His Eminence replied that the oracle said that she should appear soon, and he crossed his arms and said that they just had to wait. And he asked them, is there no faith at all? It was the one high priest of the empire's capital, Lennox Clapton, and some of his subjects pleaded that he had not slept for a month, and those men behind him were also worn out with fatigue. The man who stood beside the high priest hesitantly said that maybe His Eminence had misunderstood the oracle's message, but the man glared at him disapprovingly and said, do you have any questions? And from that look, they all fell silent and with their last strength continued to stand waiting. The priest tapped the ground with his staff and said that His Imperial Majesty was also very interested in this. He asked him to be careful what he said, but the servant was looking towards the fountain with all his eyes and could not utter a word. And while the high priest offered to repeat the hymn sung yesterday, a column of spray rose near the fountain. The high priest stood with his back to the fountain and saw nothing, and the people who had waited so long for the miracle to manifest could not believe what was happening and stared at the fountain. And he asked them what was wrong with their facial expressions and told them not to dare to say that they could not sing. But one of the servants held out a trembling hand and said frightenedly for the priest to look in the direction he was pointing his finger. The body of a man appeared on the surface of the water. Long black hair flowed through the water. At that moment, a woman came up out of the water. She sighed heavily, probably because she was short of air. The water rippled and splashes flew in different directions. She climbed out of the pool and stood on the ground. Her snow-white skin contrasted with the black color of the dress she was wearing. It was an unusually beautiful girl. She ran her hand through her hair, shaking off the water and not noticing that she was being watched intently by several dozen amazed eyes. But the next moment, as if sensing something, she turned and her blood-colored eyes locked onto the humans. People too were shaking in amazement at what they saw and could hardly utter a word. The first to wake up was the high priest and stammering with disbelief said that she was a saint, and Ides looked at her hands, which were very weak and could not understand why her body was so weak. The priest said joyfully that the Holy Virgin had appeared. His face shone with joy because he had witnessed a miracle. And IDs in the meantime started to fall from weakness and couldn't stay on her feet. Everyone rushed towards her with fright, shouting that the saint was falling. The high priest, after shoving everyone else, was the first to run up to the saint. He made a hand gesture for everyone to be quiet. He put his fingers on the saint's neck and tried to find out if there was any pulsation of the arteries, and if the saint was alive. And after a few moments, he said that he was sure that the saint was all right. After a few moments, the saint began to come to her senses, and as if in a delirium, she said that if they were going to kill her, they should do it elegantly, and she peppered her speech with a lot of profanity. The people who surrounded them from all sides were astonished at what they heard. They couldn't understand what was wrong with her. Someone said that something was wrong. A holy virgin can't swear like Lily's demoness. The high priest lowered his head in bewilderment and said that His Majesty was waiting for news. He went to the palace and reported what had happened. The monarch listened attentively and thanked him at the end for his quick report. He exclaimed that God had sent a legendary saint to the empire. This event promised many bounties, namely an abundance of minerals awaited them, which would bring prosperity to the empire. In addition, it promised special fertility of the land, and people will be able to gather rich harvests and increase their wealth. And it was also going to give this empire a lot of talented people, and all of these resources would be in one place, in the empire of Lucern. In the past, Lucern was only a small country, and the reason for its prosperity was the blessing of Ferdinand, the god of war. It was said that the emperor was sent by God himself. He even looked like him. He also sent to this land a holy maiden capable of performing miracles. The maiden was given by God to help the people live in peace and tranquility, so that the empire would prosper even more. For the first time, God sent a holy virgin to the earth, and everyone was eagerly awaiting her coming. The saint that emerged from the fountain was brought to the palace and laid in separate chambers. The emperor himself came to see her and remarked that she was beautiful. The girl lay senselessly on the bed as if she had fallen into a deep sleep. Her skin was pale and her breathing was barely audible. The high priest stood next to the emperor and was surprised to hear the praise from his lips. But the blue-eyed emperor said why not, and added that the priest spoke as if he were a monster with no sense of beauty. The priest was embarrassed and tried to justify that he didn't mean that. And he thought to himself that their emperor was 26 years old this year. His name was Raiden, although he was handsome, but his identity remained a great mystery to everyone in the empire. Emperor Raiden asked, "What is the meaning of the saint's appearance in the divine garden?" And the priest confirmed his words by saying that he himself had seen her come out of the divine fountain. He looked again at the pale girl and said that the woman who had appeared out of the water, and added that if it were not for the witnesses, he would never have believed such a story. The priest said that no doubt Ferdinand himself had sent this maiden to make their empire prosperous, but the emperor interrupted him, saying, "What nonsense is the priest talking?" And the priest in his turn resented his highness, and he glanced at the guards at the door, thinking that thank God no one had heard them. And the emperor, taking a lock of the saint's hair in his palm, said, "Is it not foolish of God to send such a lovely lady to earth?" The priest coughed, trying to suppress his own emotions, and said, "That's not the point, is it?" He looked at his monarch from under his forehead with a penetrating gaze, and he thought that, though their ruler was hard to understand, looking at him now, he noted that he was behaving in an extremely unnatural manner. The emperor had never shown any interest in the clergy. He was not interested in God or in blessing. But suddenly he became interested in the appearance of the holy maiden. It was as if he regarded her as his bride. The priest mentally berated himself for thinking that. In the next moment, though, he thought again, why was he interested in her at all? And praising her beauty in every possible way? At this time the saint let out a groan, and the high priest said animatedly that she seemed to be waking up. The girl opened her eyes and lifted herself up on the bed. She looked around in bewilderment, not realizing where she was. The emperor said that at last she was awake. She looked into his blue eyes, his face framed by blonde hair. He looked at her coldly, and she gritted her teeth and growled the name of God Ferdinand, recognizing it in the man who stood beside her bed. A grimace of hatred contorted her face, and she reached for him, wanting to claw at him. The next moment she was hugging him around the waist, as if seeking protection and support, as if they had known each other for a long time. The priest was amazed at the scene, and the saint was even more amazed. She had thrown herself at this man with a completely different intention. Why is she hugging him now? What the hell is she doing? And why is it that she can't say a single offensive word, even though she wants to say it to him? Emperor Raiden turned to the priest and asked their holy maiden, what was their mute? The priest looked at the ruler in confusion and mentally crossed himself. Then he said that the saint seemed to want to say something to him, but could not. And Ides wondered if she had really gone numb. She suddenly remembered Ferdinand asking her if she could not swear for a day, and she realized that he had put a spell on her so that she could not say a bad word to anyone. And the emperor thought, what an impudent lady. She looked at him with eyes full of anger but could not say anything, though she was filled with fierce hatred and wanted to spit in his face all that she thought of him. Suddenly it struck her that something was wrong. She was surprised to note that his eyes were a different shade of... Eads took another look at his face. She wondered why his eyes had turned blue, and what had happened to his lips. He hadn't smiled once in the last century. The high priest approached them and offered the saint the use of paper and pen so that she could write whatever she wanted to say. But Ides was skewered again with anger. All these people annoyed her terribly. She wanted to scream that she didn't fucking need this. And the high priest, unaware of her true thoughts and mood, said that first of all he would like to introduce himself. And he bowed his head in greeting and said that his name was Lennox Clapton, and he was the high priest of the Lucern Empire. He then pointed to Ferdinand and pronounced that this was their emperor, His Majesty Raiden. Ides couldn't believe that she was facing an emperor, and that she was really in the human world. She realized that he just looked like Ferdinand. Her brain was feverishly thinking, could such a coincidence be possible and this emperor be like the god of war? For the first time, her face reflected not anger and rage, but incomprehension and surprise. And the high priest, seeing this change, said that she must be confused. And he explained that according to the oracle in the divine garden, Ferdinand himself was to send a holy maiden that would help the prosperity of their empire. And he added to a discouraged Ides that everyone was really looking forward to her appearance. That was a super ridiculous statement. She's a supreme demon, become a holy maiden. A new wave of rage came over Ides. She groped helplessly for air, but couldn't utter a single word. When the first wave of rage passed, Ides remembered Ferdinand saying that he was giving her another chance. And she realized that the bastard had reincarnated her to do good deeds and become a saint maiden. She was literally shaking with rejection of this reality. She thought that she had been through everything: betrayal, death of loved ones, murder. But to turn her into a human being, and a saint. And not noticing the perplexed looks of the priest and the emperor, she mentally promised that she would give Ferdinand a reprisal. She heard herself being addressed and opening her eyes. She remembered where she was. She was so angry that she kept holding her fists clenched in anger against her face. The high priest asked her to introduce herself. He asked if she had a name. But all Ides wanted was to incinerate these people, and she took in a lungful of air and screamed with all the hatred she could muster. But no sound came out of her mouth. It struck her again that she couldn't express any negative emotions. And she wrapped her arms around her head, regretting that she couldn't even blow off steam and that this was some kind of mockery. And the emperor and the high priest stood staring at her, not knowing what was wrong with her. Ides decided she had to get out of here as soon as possible, and she would rip the heart out of Ferdinand's body and feed it to the Cerberus as soon as she got to him. Suddenly, blood-colored energy flowed down her arms and her hands began to cramp, and it was hurting Ides. She looked at her arm and saw the bloody mesh of arteries showing on it. She remembered Ferdinand saying that if she attacked anyone or didn't do good deeds, she would die the most painful death. She remembered his appearance and thought, this bastard is not going to live. And suddenly it dawned on her, and without noticing the commotion that had begun around her, she thought that this creature Ferdinand had sent her to the human world, making her promise that if she held out here, she would be allowed to kill him. She remembered that he'd said he'd keep a close eye on her, and she thought it sounded like some kind of taunt. But he'd always kept his promises. A year. She had to last a year in this world, be polite and friendly and do good. She remembered again the image of the courageous and strong god of war. She would endure this ordeal, and then she would finish him off for good. She was pulled from her thoughts by Priest Lennox, who asked her what was wrong. He looked anxiously at her face and said that if she had a pain anywhere, she should tell them. But Ides continued to tremble without saying a word. Then Emperor Raiden turned to the servants and commanded that a physician be brought immediately. And Ides whispered something about good deeds, and the priest questioned what she meant, but she continued as if in delirium to speak in fragments of phrases about how to survive. Thinking that to avenge all her humiliations, she must... Ides clenched her fist as if gathering all her self-control and will into that fist and said that she wanted to help them. She must play by his vile rules. And Ides' eyes lit up with demonic fire. She heard a man say indignantly that he wanted to meet the emperor, and he was taken to some wench. He was a fat man with a long braided beard. He was sitting on a chair, and behind him stood two stout men. They looked at her and then leaned over to the one sitting there and told him that the emperor was just trying to placate them and advised him not to fall for her beauty. It was an obvious trap. They were being insolent and cavalier. The priest was angry at this behavior and demanded that they show respect, for they had the great honor of being the first to see the face of the Holy Virgin. He said that they should be grateful for this opportunity. Such a statement caused an explosion of laughter on the part of these impertinent men, and they began to mock the priest and the holy maiden. Lennox Clapton was angered by the ignorant behavior of these commoners. He was filled with rage. The head healer mockingly stated that if this woman was a saint, he must be the Lord himself, and he laughed. Ides thought that these people, why had His Highness called them in the first place? He said that educating the ignorant was a good thing, just like the sainted maiden. He knew that the physician didn't believe in divine powers, but to mock a saint like that was blasphemy. Ides tried to get up from the couch she was sitting on, but she was so weak that she collapsed to the floor. The priest rushed to her to help her. The laughter got even worse, and one of the men said that she could hardly stand on her feet. The high priest demanded that they stop their bickering now. He put his hand on the priestess's shoulder and felt her trembling with weakness. He said, addressing her, that he would take her to the infirmary. He added that he did not intend to tolerate such boorish treatment of their holy maiden. He looked at her and noticed that everything around her was on fire. And Ides thought that as soon as she left this damn world, she'd finish these scum off first. No mortal dared to mock her. Even in the demon world, everyone bowed before her greatness. She clenched her fist again. It was very hard for her, but she gathered the rest of her strength, determined to make them. Those pathetic people. And with an effort of will, she slowly raised her hand, pointing at them with her index finger. Again, derision was heard from the sidelines about the fact that she was also mute. But the next moment, everyone froze in surprise. It was as if a light breeze had wafted through the room. Ides thought she was going to make those damn people bow down to her greatness, and a white misty haze began to spread around her. But she failed at what she could pull off before just by thinking about it. She thought she wanted to vaporize this pathetic worm. Why can't she do that? And the next moment she realized that that bastard Ferdinand had sealed her powers as well, and she thought about how much she hated him. The healer mockingly asked again, gilding her pen. She was almost killed by her worst enemy, and instead of dying, he sent her to Earth, sealing her powers, making her the weakest being human. But that's not enough. She's being mocked by some uncouth animal. And she thought in despair that it would be better if the bastard had just killed her. She saw the healer rise from his chair and demanded that the priest confess that there was no saint. The clergy once again fooled the people by making idiots out of ordinary people and inventing all sorts of falsehoods. And he said he'd had enough of this bollocks. But Ides looked at him differently. Her gaze changed, and the warmth of it seemed to make flowers bloom around her. She looked into his eyes, and they widened as if he saw a marvelous thing in front of him. He knelt down before her and, looking at her in fascination, said, "Holy maiden," and he asked her to tell him her name. Ides was no less amazed than the healer. She was astonished at the reaction and did not understand what had caused the change. And the healer covered his eyes and said that her name was of no importance, and he asked permission to confess to her that he had fallen in love with her at first sight. Everyone was amazed at this sudden change. The dazed priest opened his mouth in surprise. Ides had no idea what was happening. Her demonic nature ran rampant at such a display of affection. Couldn't Ides take it into her head that he was carrying such a thing? Suddenly she found herself thinking that she felt strange. The pain that had been piercing her whole body was gone. The first to come to their senses were the men who had accompanied the healer. They were indignant. What was he talking about? They asked in surprise, "What's the matter with him?" But the healer, unresponsive to those around him, kept saying how beautiful the saint was, and that he could not take his eyes off her beautiful face. The guard waved his hand in front of his face, demanding that he wake up, but it was in vain. Then he fell on his back and rolled around on the floor, laughing as if he had seen something funny. The brothers rushed over to him. One said that he had asked him not to be fooled by the beauty of this girl, and the other lamented that they had come here to make a lot of money. They just needed to get the information and send it to the right person, and he let them down. The high priest was getting angrier and angrier as he listened to their speeches, and finally ordered the guards to capture these heretics. The men realized they were in big trouble, and one of them said that if it hadn't been for that girl, everything would have gone exactly according to plan. Ides looked at them confused, still not understanding what had happened to the healer. But at that moment, one of the brothers rushed towards her, bypassing the guards and wanting to hurt her for what she had done to his brother. But the next moment, the same thing happened to him as to the healer. His eyes widened, and he looked at Ides with a look full of love. He couldn't understand what this strange feeling was. His legs went under, and he began to settle on the floor, saying that it felt like he had learned all the beauty of this world in an instant. As if mesmerized, he began to babble about how beautiful everything was, and thanked the Holy Maiden for bestowing her divine blessing on him. Once again, everyone grimaced at what was happening, not realizing what was happening to these people, and he knelt down and said that he swore from this day forward to be her faithful follower for the rest of his life. But the healer unceremoniously pushed him away, angrily saying that it was he who would glorify the name of the saint. And the brother complainingly said that he was a greedy man. But the other brother, who was watching, cried out that they were both mad, and he accused the saint, calling her a bloody witch, of bewitching them. And shouting that she was no saint, he pulled a knife from behind his back and flung it at her, screaming for her to die, the creature. An imperial guard threw himself at him, trying to stop him. He managed to knock him down, and the bully collapsed to the floor, dropping the knife. Opening his eyes, he looked angrily at the saint and said that she was a bloody devil and because of her. But he couldn't finish. The next moment he too was smitten by her magic. He looked adoringly at the maiden and said that he realized how beautiful the world was, and said in awe that she was a holy maiden. Ides wanted to tear the hair out of her head. She stared at them with hateful eyes, but they only fell in love with her more, and she mentally sent curses to Ferdinand. At this time the priest went to the emperor to tell him that thanks to the powers of the saint, the visitors to the palace realized their sinfulness, and swore allegiance to the holy maiden. Emperor Raiden was at first surprised that this was the case, but then his lips stretched into an enigmatic smile, and he said curiously, "She was the strongest demon in the underworld. She possessed 2 horns and 3 pairs of black wings, attributes that proved her superiority over the others. Everyone who ever saw her in battle swore allegiance to her and asked to become her loyal subject. However, this is a story of bygone days. The strongest demon in the underworld has become an ordinary mortal. She was sitting in a room at a table, and on the opposite wall hung a painting of the god of war. The high priest standing beside her noticed her interest and asked her, 'Does she seem to be interested in this painting?' And without waiting for her reply, Lennox Clapton told her that it depicted Ferdinand, the god of war, at the moment of victory over the forces of evil. And he added that she had excellent taste in painting. Ides did not like his words, and he added that as expected of a holy maiden, she recognized her god at once. And that remark made her cringe. She sat at the table and thought, since when had Ferdinand defeated the forces of evil? She didn't remember that. She was hungry for some reason when she arrived on Earth. She had been given a good meal, probably because of her status as a saint. But to be honest, it was him, the emperor, that she cared about more than anything else in the world right now. Meanwhile, he listened to the report on what had happened to those gentlemen who had infiltrated the palace. As it turned out, they were tasked to infiltrate the palace and get more information about the emperor. It was treason. Based on the laws of the empire, they went to jail. They surrendered voluntarily. They self-consciously promised that in prison they would think over all their mistakes and repent of their sins, and asked that the holy maiden should at least occasionally appear before their eyes, so that they might glorify her holy countenance. Emperor Raiden asked that they had all succumbed to the spell of the holy maiden, and the high priest confirmed it, having said that, to be more precise, their holy maiden has a unique gift. People should encounter her gaze for just 3 seconds, and afterwards they would feel a rush of bliss and love. But the emperor asked, "What is this strange ability?" and added that it was very suspicious, and Ides's eulogy of the priest made her want to vomit. But Lennox Clapton said with such reverence that the holy maiden gives her parishioners the love of God that there was a suspicion that he too was under her spell. Emperor Raiden thought for a moment, and then asked where he got this information from, and the priest said that he had studied the ancient records of the previous high priests. They all described this ability as a divine gift from Ferdinand himself. Emperor Raiden put back the book he held in his hands, and pronounced that as if these old men had seen the face of God at least once. But the priest replied that in any case the authenticity of those records had been confirmed by the holy maiden herself. And the emperor asked, what else about the powers of the saint was said in those records? There wasn't much information, because no one with the power of a god had ever set foot on our lands before that day. And the emperor thought about the ability to deceive people's senses, making them loyal pawns, and he pronounced it sounded like demonic charms, and Ides choked on her food when he said it. But Priest Lennox endeavored to assure him that his majesty was mistaken. It is a gift that allows people who have never known the love of the Lord to experience his grace for themselves. There was no malice in this power their saint possessed. It was necessary for people to be happy. After all, that was why the holy maiden was sent to them from heaven. Ides, who was eating, listening to their conversation, cringed and thought it was disgusting. She realized that the more she listened to it, the more she would boil over with anger. But if you think about it that way, it quote s ironic to the point of impossible. She is the ruler of the underworld itself who tried with her army to kill God. She became a holy virgin and a messenger of God, and she smiled gloatingly at the thought, thinking that if she told any of her soldiers, no one would believe it. She looked at her mark on her arm and noted that it was beginning to pulse again. She remembered those 3 people. She wanted to kill those 3 uncouth primates, but as soon as she used her new power, the pain receded. And she couldn't help the growing pain, she said. "What the hell is this?" The priest standing next to her asked, perplexed, "What's wrong, her wrist hurts?" Ides thought that it was as if neither this dumb-faced emperor nor this juvenile holier-than-thou kid had noticed the mark on her arm. She closed her eyes and thought. The priest was trying to get her to answer, but she couldn't hear him. She didn't think it was important. She had to come up with a strategy first. But first she decided to understand what she was capable of with this new power. And she opened her eyes and looked at the priest and the emperor. At this moment, her meditations were interrupted by the priest, who said that her countenance was 1 minute creased. And he asked that did she not like the dishes? Or was she in pain? And he told her not to hesitate to ask him for help. He would do his best. Ides uttered that it was very strange, and then added that she wanted to understand something. She said she was using her divine power on them now, but it didn't seem to be working on them at all. And she asked why that was. The priest and the emperor looked at each other. They were surprised that she had used her power on them. The priest looked at the lady saint in surprise and said that he was the high priest and had already learnt the love of God. And as for the emperor, he looked in his direction and saw him grinning ironically. The priest thought that if he were not the emperor, he would have reprimanded him for this sneer towards the holy maiden, citing blasphemy, but he could not admit that the emperor did not believe in God. The emperor at this time looked at the holy maiden, who was eating food without using cutlery, and asked that had she not been taught manners in the kingdom of God. Ides didn't like his smugness and wondered if he was angry because she had used powers without permission. And she replied defiantly that she hadn't been taught. He went over to the table at which she was sitting and said with a sneer, "What a pity." But Ides replied that it was as it was. She thought that he dared to insult the heavenly messenger, and she realized that the bastard was no stranger to the world. Smiling smugly, Emperor Raiden said that in truth, he was not interested in manners or etiquette. He was tired of all this contrived politeness, and he said he had a question for her too. And he leaned towards her and asked her why she was looking at him with such passion. Ides recoiled as if struck by a blow. Her face was horrified, as if a snake had been slipped into her face without her noticing, though it would not have caused such emotion. She could only squeeze out a look of surprise. But the emperor, as if not noticing her reaction, asked, "Wasn't he right?" Ides's eyes flashed angrily with a bloody color. She was blazing with indignation at his insolent claim that she was watching with passion. She wanted to strangle him over that painfully familiar face. And she lost control and reached for his face, intending to fulfill her wish and tear his cheeky face off so he wouldn't dare smirk like that. Everyone was horrified by the situation and the undisguised aggression of the holy maiden. The priest stood open-mouthed, and the servants froze in horror. But the emperor intercepted her arm, leaving her no chance to harm herself. He stared piercingly into her eyes without saying a word. The pause dragged on. Everyone froze and seemed not to dare even to breathe. The guards stood silently looking at each other, not knowing what to do, for the saint had attacked their monarch. But he continued to squeeze her wrist, and then at last he uttered, "Why on earth was she pulling her dainty hand towards him?" And at that moment the priest said that His Majesty's hair was disheveled, and that the holy maiden must have wanted to fix it. And then he said how kind of her. And he let go her hand. Then he put his hand on her head as if to bless her and said that he thought she wanted to swear at him. He added that he must have been mistaken and stepped away from her. But the priest said that in heaven the gods knew no profanity, and he thought, how could he treat the saint like a little child? And he added that the saint was sent to them by the gods, and they do not know about profanity, evil, and vices. And to smooth things over, he added that she would address him with all honor. And he asked that Raiden treat her more respectfully, and the emperor crossed his arms over his chest and said that he was doing it anyway. Ides, listening to their conversation, was beginning to boil again. She thought with irritation that how could she address them with deference? To these bugs? Never going to happen. The priest, meanwhile, continued to instruct Raiden that there was no such thing in the worldview of the saints. The emperor said, looking at Ides, that in his opinion they had much to lose by not allowing themselves such a thing. Priest Lennox wanted to change the topic of conversation and suggested to return to the main topic of conversation. But the emperor could not remember what their conversation had been about. And the high priest, with reverently folded hands, reminded that they said that the powers of the saint allow a person to know love and faith in God. And he added that this power only worked on non-believers. This astonished Raiden and Ides, and seeing their confusion, he explained that the ancient records of the past high priests said that this power was given by God to attract new followers to his side. Ides stretched out in surprise. What did he mean to say that her power might not work on every person? And then the priest explained to her that a man must feel either hatred or disgust towards her for her power to work. In this way, it was as if she were cleansing his soul of all vices. When Ides realized that this ability had its limitations, she was angry again, and she wanted to blow everything to hell. Everything she saw in front of her, turn it all to ashes. But this emotion immediately gave her a headache, and even her eyes began to hurt. The priest said that she still had not given her name, and with that sudden question he caught her off guard. She hesitated, and the priest, seeing her confusion, asked if she didn't have one. Ides stretched out the word, name, uncertainly, and she remembered that centuries ago in the underworld, she had been given the name Ides, which meant the strongest. Though she had been given a name, no mortal had ever addressed her by name. In all her years of service, she may have had a different name at birth, but the memory of those days had long since been erased from her recollections. In the darkness of her mind, there was nothing but hatred for that very bastard. Ides wondered how much time had passed, and she had never once thought about her real name. She lived only for revenge, and her hands were covered in blood. She looked at her hands and thought that she had lived so long that she had forgotten. Why did she want revenge? What was Ferdinand's fault that was causing a storm of hatred in her heart? And what happens when she finishes him off? What happens to her? The Emperor hummed. His lips curved into a grin again. He spoke the name Salie, and asked how she liked that name. It was as if something shook in her heart when he said that name. She didn't even realize it was because of the name. But it was some strange feeling, unknown or long forgotten. Her memory brought back the memory of a wonderful garden filled with sunlight and flowers. And there she was, joyful and happy. And there he was, Ferdinand, the god of war. And he called that name Salie, and she smiled happily. But why did it hurt now that she was hearing that name? She continued to press her palm to her chest in confusion, and the Emperor and the priest stared at her, not daring to break the silence. Ides had a feeling that was her real name, and the tears rolled down from her eyes without will, and she continued to sit there without noticing, until the Emperor asked her why she was crying. And then she looked up at him and realized that she had shown weakness, and that this weakness had been seen by others. In a second, she was a fury. Her hands clenched into fists, her temples throbbing at the thought that this mortal dared to mock her, her feelings. She jumped up and lunged at him. She threw herself lightning fast without noticing anyone around her, and the priest who was standing next to her did not understand what caused such a reaction in the holy maiden. It seemed to him that his majesty could not escape death. But in the next second, as soon as she approached the Emperor, he enclosed her in his arms, and she clung to him as if she had no hatred or anger that had previously possessed her. They were like a couple in love, and everyone who looked at them at that moment did not doubt it for a moment. Raiden looked at her with his blue eyes and said that this was how they expressed their feelings in heaven. Eyed skewed with anger, but it was as if he had some special effect on her, because her anger instantly vanished when she was in his arms. And he went on to say, holding her gently by the waist, that he did not know why that name made her weep, but whether the holy maiden herself, wanting comfort so badly. And there was so much sarcasm in that phrase that she recoiled from him. It was already too much, and she asked him what he thought she really wanted. And looking at his face, she spat out that she despised their god. It was all because of him. When the priest heard this, he clutched his head as her words rang out. But the Emperor apparently liked her words, because he declared that since he had given him such a gift, he would reconsider his attitude towards him. Lennox Clapton could not bear it any longer. He covered his eyes with his hands so that he would not see this depravity, and begged his majesty to release the holy maiden. At that moment the door opened and a servant entered the room with a respectful bow, saying that my lady Verdie wished to see his majesty at once. The priest came up to him and asked that my lady should not have gone to the training. The messenger replied that she had left in the middle of the training, saying that she had something urgent to discuss with his majesty. The priest thought that my lady must not see it, and he said that his majesty was very busy at the moment and would come to her later. But my lady Verdie Mortica was already on the threshold. She was a thin, fair-haired, blue-eyed girl. She was a candidate for the role of the holy maiden of the people, and she was looking at the Emperor with all eyes. The priest tried his best to divert her attention, so that she would not notice this immodest embrace of the Emperor and the holy maiden. But she opened her mouth in astonishment and asked, "What kind of obscenities are going on here?" And the Emperor and Ides stood in each other's arms and looked at her as if unaware of what was going on around them. Again, the priest tried to salvage the situation by saying that the holy maiden was giving their Emperor a blessing. But there was disappointment in my lady Verdie's eyes, and she asked, "Is this really the way to give a blessing?" And Ides at last demanded that the Emperor let her go and withdrew herself from him. The priest tried to extricate himself from such an unpleasant situation and said it was an accident. But my lady Verdie could hardly believe it, and she asked why the Holy Virgin was giving the blessing in such an unfavorable place. And the priest looked sternly at the Emperor and thought that Mrs. Verdie's suspicions were not groundless. She is recognized by the imperial family and the people as a holy virgin, graduating with honors from a theological seminary, performing various charitable works. She became a favorite of the people and also the only saint. But Mrs. Verdie had recently gone on a pilgrimage across the empire, and she never expected that on her return she will meet a real holy maiden sent to them by the Lord himself. They stood looking at each other in silence, Raiden and Ides on one side and the priest and my lady Verdie on the other. But the Emperor was the first to say that there was a prophecy that a holy maiden would descend upon their lands, and it happened this morning in the divine garden. Ides stood in front of her and everyone called her the holy maiden, and Verdie had to agree with that. She stood there with such a forlorn and lost look that even the priest did not know what to say or how to comfort her. But she was filled with doubt, so she knelt down before the Emperor and asked what about her. What would happen to her now? Would they have no use for her now? But she had worked hard for the prosperity of the empire. She said that she wanted to stand with him, the Emperor, and he said that he had said nothing of the kind and asked her to stand up. My lady Verdie stood up and pronounced that since God had sent them a holy maiden, let her be allowed to be trained in the affairs of the outside world. And the Emperor agreed. But Ides protested and said no. But Raiden, calling her Sally, said that she should realize that it was up to him. The priest covered his mouth with his hand and thought it was so cruel. The next moment, my Lady Verdie opened her eyes and looked intently at Edie's. Something was wrong with her, she thought. Those blood-red, not at all angelic eyes. There was defiance in them and not an ounce of the humility of all saints. And she thought, was this girl the holy maiden sent by God? And doubt crept into her soul with renewed vigor. It couldn't be, she thought as she looked into her eyes and felt the demonic forces trying to drag her to the very bottom of the underworld. And Verdie asked, apologizing in advance for being rude, is she really a holy maiden? And Ides replied irritably that she could not see. They stood staring at each other as if trying to see through what was going on deep inside each of them. Suddenly my Lady Verdie said, without taking her eyes off Ides, that she was no saint. She held a large cross with a blue stone in the center in front of her, and demanded that Ides not come any closer. She pronounced her look and haughty appearance, and then she pointed the cross sharply before her and, like an incantation, said a prayer to the great god Ferdinand. She prayed that he would grant her, his faithful novice Verdie, strength. Everyone froze. The guards stood with their mouths open, not realizing what was happening. The emperor crossed his arms on his chest and watched the scene skeptically. Only the priest woke up and was horrified at what was happening. He called out to Lady Verdie and asked her what she was carrying. But Verdie wilted and answered him that she had seen this girl in her prophetic dream, and that dream was truly a nightmare. In this dream, the whole kingdom was in darkness, and the holy maiden herself was a demon steeped in blood. And this demoness sat in the palace with a devilish grin on her face. But the high priest said that with all due respect to Lady Verdie, he himself had seen the holy maiden appear to them, and he claimed it was a gift from God, no other way. Verdie turned to him and asked him what he meant, that she was lying? But the priest pronounced that he did not say so. And then Lady Verdie appealed to His Majesty to lock up this impostor in a dungeon to avoid catastrophe, and she added that if he didn't, it would be irreparable. Edes sat there thinking that Lady Verdie was partly right, but she was getting worse by the minute. The pain was getting worse. She remembered how she had done a good deed by bewitching 3 fools, and in doing so she had experienced such an abomination. The thought made her feel even worse, and she thought that she couldn't even breathe. She felt bad immediately, because she wasn't doing anything good. She just wanted to scream, but she couldn't. And she realized that she had to do something good. Otherwise, this feeling would not go away. The priest was still bickering with Lady Verdie, persuading her that he had seen with his own eyes the maiden emerge from the divine pond. But she replied that a demon of high rank could have created such an illusion. And Ides, agonizing in pain, uttered the words, "Good deeds." And at this moment the emperor intervened, demanding that Lady Verdie and the priest should be silent. The priest paid attention to the holy maiden and seeing her condition asked, "Is she not well?" But she couldn't take the torture any longer and jumped up and said she wanted to do good deeds now. His headdress flew off his head and fell to the floor. Lady Verdie shrieked at this occurrence, seeing it as a bad omen, and the priest cried out that he knew it, and triumphantly pronounced that Ides was a holy maiden and no other, and he uttered it for everyone to look at her. What demon in his right mind would want to do good deeds? She, on the other hand, wants to bestow upon their people an all-consuming love and faith in the god Ferdinand. And he asked, does Lady Verdie still consider her a demoness? Lady Verdie repeated his words that the maiden wished to bestow an all-consuming love, but in her voice there was a question. Was it so? And then the emperor pronounced that he had heard her, and for her own comfort offered to look at the powers of the holy maiden. And when Lady Verdie agreed, he asked her, until they were finally convinced, not to spread the bad news of her prophetic dream among the people. Ides was getting weaker by the minute, and the priest, concerned about her condition, asked if she was okay or if she needed help. Lady Verdie looked at Ides with a look of almost colorless eyes. She had a feeling that the maiden had no divine powers. She felt nothing holy from her countenance. And on top of that, it annoyed her that His Highness was being so kind to this demoness. In Verdie's eyes, he'd never left Ides's side, and she promised herself she would expose her. The emperor turned to her and called out to Lady Verdie, and she gladly hastened to his call, thinking that she was the only one who could be by His Highness's side. And joy was in her eyes again, and she pronounced that on her way to the capital, she had heard tidings from the suffering people, that there was a village that was being tormented by a demon, and she said that since Ides was a holy maiden, she could deal with this evil. The priest protested, saying it was wrong. The holy maiden cannot fight evil. She is only a counselor, nothing more. But Ides stopped him and asked him where this village was, and declared that she was going there at once. To Lennox, it looked as if she had pronounced that no matter how bad she felt, people were suffering far more from this hellspawn. And he collapsed on his knees before her and pronounced that she was so kind and self-sacrificing, and he declared that he, Lennox Clapton, would go with her even to the depths of the underworld. He ordered the carriage to be prepared at once. Ides looked at him uncertainly, wondering if they would go so fast, and the priest in turn thought that whatever lay ahead of them, he would always be at her side. He rose from his knees and pronounced that they were going to the village. On the way to the bloody village, the four of them rode together, she and Priest Lennox on one horse, Verdie and the Emperor on different horses. They met many people, but not a single mortal who needed help. Ides was exhausted and held on with her last strength. She sat behind the priest and thought about the fact that she couldn't use her powers either. Of all of them, only the saintly Verdie was despised here. But because of her steadfast faith, Ides' charms had no effect on her. And once again she sent Ferdinand her curses. Her head was pounding. The high priest, sensing her weakness, asked if she was sure she was all right. But Ides assured him that all was well and asked him if they would reach the place soon, and the priest replied that they were almost there. He also said that she could pray for him, and Ides asked how to do that. He explained to her that it was not so difficult. When you pray, you should bow your head and join your hands together, and afterwards to say briefly, "May the strength, wisdom, love, and compassion of Lord Ferdinand be granted." Ides couldn't stand the name of that bastard Ferdinand. She was already sick enough, and after hearing his name, it was unbearable. She dug her fingernails into the hood of the priest's head, who was sitting in front of her, and he shrieked in surprise. And she wanted to scream something she'd never say in her life. All this commotion attracted the Emperor's attention. He asked puzzledly what they were doing. Verdie didn't answer him anything, only thought that Ides had squeezed his skull so hard, and she had that angry look in her eyes. She pulled the reins and commanded the horse to go forward, wanting to get closer to Ides and Lennox. She was almost beside them now, and commanded that Ides take her hands off the priest immediately. But it was Lennox himself who was most frightened by her cry. He asked, perplexed, what did Lady Verdie want? And she took out her cross again, and held it out in front of her and pronounced that Ides had finally revealed her true intentions. And like a madwoman, she asked God to give her the power to cleanse this brat. From the strong flow of energy, Priest Lennox had to cover his face, and even his horse nervously shook its head and began to beat its hoof on the ground. At the same time, a child's cry was heard, and the priest demanded that Lady Verdie stop immediately. He asked if she had any idea how this power was affecting the children around her. Verdie Mordecai began to look around. She too had heard the child's cry but could not see it. Lennox was looking around too, for he could hear a child screaming somewhere nearby. Ides disappeared too, and after a while they saw her not far away under a spreading tree. She was holding a child in her arms. Lady Verdie thought that she had, after all, only just sat on the horse, when she had time to take the child and step back. And Ides was soothing the baby, telling her that everything was okay so she would stop being scared and crying. Lady Verdie thought that this purification would be enough to blind even a strong demon, and she doubted for the first time that she was right, and that Ides could really be a holy maiden. She dismounted from her horse, and the doubt that no living creature could have jumped off her horse in time to carry the child so far away filled her soul again. Only a demon of the highest rank could do that. She was so preoccupied with this thought that she didn't even realize that the Emperor had approached her. He called out to her to attract her attention. He asked her sternly, who had allowed her to be unruly? His stern tone hurt her so badly that she didn't know what to say. And then she excused herself by saying that she just wanted to help Lennox. But he said, still as sternly as before, that he had asked her not to act recklessly. He said he would make up his own mind about the Holy Maiden. And finally he asked that the Emperor's words were nothing to her. Lady Verdie began to assure him that this was not so. She really only wanted to protect Lennox from evil forces. His tone was so hurtful and offensive that tears sprang to her eyes, and she covered them to contain her emotions. But the Emperor turned his back on her and said in his heart that he would not tolerate disobedience next time. He went to Ides, who was still standing under the tree cradling the baby, and Verdie thought, why is he being so harsh with her? Even when she made mistakes before, His Highness never got angry with her. He must have changed because of the enchantment. He turned his back on her, leaving her without his support and attention, and all because of that demoness's shenanigans. It's all her fault. The demoness from her dream who came to destroy their empire. Ides, who was holding the baby in her arms at the time, was so absorbed in her that she seemed oblivious to what was going on around her. Until she heard a question behind her asking if she was all right. She turned her head and looked at the Emperor in surprise. She gently placed the baby on the ground and pronounced that the baby seemed fine. But Raiden focused his eyes on Ides and pronounced that he cared more about her than the baby. Ides fixed her hair with her hand, tucking it behind her ear, and said she was fine too. But he suddenly intercepted her hand. The scratched forearm came to his attention. He looked at it silently at first, and then he looked at Ides and said that she was hurt, and added that the Holy Maiden must take care of her fragile body. Then he commanded that the wound should be treated. But Ides was already sick of his moralizing, and she yanked her hand away and pronounced that the scratch would heal before her demise. She wanted to add more so he wouldn't worry, but suddenly a thought struck her. She looked down at her hands again in surprise and noted that her body was no longer in unbearable pain. Was it really about saving the child? And she again assured the Emperor, who was watching her closely, that she was all right. But after a moment, her eyes became focused again because she thought she didn't know when she might get sick again. She turned to the little girl she had rescued and told her that something terrible was happening in the neighboring village. Then she asked if she knew anything about it. But the little girl was either very scared or really didn't know anything, but she only shook her head negatively. Ides noticed a particular violet glow that was located on the little girl's chest, peeking out only slightly from under her shirt. Her eyes instantly lit up because she recognized the sign. She clutched at her shirt and pulled back the edge of it, revealing a purple stain with diverging rays in all directions. The priest standing next to him asked anxiously what it was. It was the first time he had ever seen such a thing. And Ides replied that it was demon seed. Demons infect human children, turning them into their own kind. She was filled with anger. Demons don't like to coddle children, so they invented a way to make a human child into an adult and independent individual. It's a disgusting and low act even for her, so when she became the supreme demon, she got it forbidden to create demons out of humans. But once she became mortal, they were back to their old ways. She was astonished by this discovery. She was brought out of her reverie by Priest Lennox, asking what would happen to the child. Ide sat down in front of the little girl and smiled at her, and said that the children's bodies were weak and imperfect before the powerful demon. They would not be able to resist the evil forces, and in the end, the child's body would be torn apart, and a new one would be born from its remains. She turned to Lady Verdie and, shouting at her, ordered her to come this way. Lady Verdie did not realize at once that Ides was addressing her, and only when she had clarified and received an affirmative answer did she come closer. Ides looked at her and asked if she could purify this child with her cross. Verdie replied that she could, but it was up to Ides to prove that she was a true holy virgin. So she suggested that she herself should cleanse the child of its filth. Ides had to admit that she couldn't do it, so she called Verdie, for whom it was strange because Ides is a saint sent by God. She didn't have time to wonder how she was incapable of cleansing away the filth and what was that supposed to mean. Ides grabbed her by the shoulders and shook her with an angry expression. What was Verdie thinking, mocking her now? It was a direct threat, and Verdie pronounced that they didn't know how long ago this child had been infected. But Ides squeezed the girl's shoulder harder, causing her physical pain. She turned black with anger and said that if Verdie continued to be insolent and inactive, the child's death would be on her conscience. Who knows when the demon would break out? So she had to hurry. And unable to endure the torture any longer, Verdie said she would do it. She squatted down in front of the little girl and placed her palm against her breast and concentrated. A small white glow appeared. Verdie closed her eyes and turned into a golden blob of energy herself, as if God Ferdinand himself was emitting this light. She channeled all his strength and power inside the chest of the child, who had hitherto stood silent and unmoving. Suddenly that purple blob pulsed in the little girl's chest and a small crystal separated from it. Verdie felt it under her hands. She could feel that demonic essence begin to come out of the child. And finally this crystal fell to the ground and clattered to the ground with a clang. Verdie was exhausted from the effort, and her hands were pressed to the ground. And without opening her eyes, she said it was done. The little girl staggered too and started to fall, but Ides picked her up, before grabbing a purple crystal from the ground and clasping it in her fist. But in her hands the crystal suddenly cracked. At this time Verdie thought of Ides and could not believe it. She was overcome with indignation. How could she treat her like this? Who did she think she was? Ides too watched Verdie and saw that she had not had an easy time of it. She took the senseless child in her arms and called Verdie a white-haired woman, which again horrified her. But when Verdie looked at her, Ides smiled at her, probably for the first time since they'd met, and told her she'd done a good job and added that she was stronger than Ides thought she was. Verdie continued to sit on the ground. Her strength was slowly returning to her. She looked after Ides and thought that she was suspicious of her behavior and insulted her all the time. She who cannot cleanse the body of its filth is not worthy to be called a great saint. But still some doubt crept into her heart, and she wondered if she had been too hasty in her accusations. So she rose to her feet. She looked at Ides again and thought that maybe no one was perfect, not even the great saint. It would be strange if she were perfect. And besides, her strong nature had fascinated Verdie. Ides approached the emperor and the priest, and said that she was sure there were others infected and they must save them. The emperor supported her, saying that they should hurry before it was too late. The priest said that the village was not far away. After 4 days, Ides realized that things were crappy. After all, no progress was being made. 4 days ago, they arrived in the village, but it was completely silent. They later learned that 2 children had been found dead with their bellies torn open. The villagers were horrified. Luckily, they were able to find all the infected children and Verdie cured them. But they hadn't found the demon instigator, so they had to delay. Ides was just going crazy with inaction and couldn't put her mind to where he might be hiding. Raiden and Lennox could stay no longer and put off their duties, so they returned to the capital, and he and Verdie were left alone. After they'd left, Ides hadn't let go of the thought that the demon must be here somewhere. It was as if she could feel its presence and couldn't relax. Suddenly weakness came over Ides. She rubbed her forehead with her hand and thought that she hadn't rested much lately, her body on edge, and the mark on my arm never ceased to remind me of itself, throbbing with pain. She said that until a couple of days ago, she was feeling much better, and IDs thought for the first time that maybe she should call people together and give everyone a blessing. Verdie, who had been somewhere nearby the whole time, watching Ides, came up to her and threw something into her hands. She said it was for her. She stepped back and stood behind the tree watching for Edie's to eat, and Ides held what Verdie had given her and thought, what had she made her this time? She also caught herself thinking that it was not easy for her to be alone with Verdie, but in her defense, she could say that he did not insult her or hit her. Verdie continued to watch as Ides unwrapped the sandwich she had made for her and took a bite out of it. She was curious if she liked it, but Ides had no time to chew the sandwich she had been offered and began to spit it out of her mouth. She asked Verdie indignantly what she had put in it, and added that she thought she was going to kill her. But Verdie said she used only the freshest and healthiest products, kizu root and mugwort seeds. And Ides said annoyed, why should she go to all this trouble? At that moment, a girl ran towards them screaming for help. She was calling for Seely. She said that she had seen a man with horns and black wings, and she added that he was now under the hill. Ides jumped up and clenched her hand into a fist, triumphant that he had come at last. She thought to herself that he had violated the ban on the inviolability of children for nothing, and anticipating her revenge, she thought that now he could blame himself. Turning to the child, she mouthed for her to take them to this demon sooner rather than later. At the foot of the hill, a demon was indeed running rampant. It had golden hair and 2 horns on its head. His eyes also glowed with a golden light. He was looking around and cursing the mean people. His eyes radiated a malicious fire, and he said threateningly that he was going to get them. He would turn them all into demons, and they would work for him in the underworld of hell. Ides, Verdie, and the little girl had come to the hill at this time and were watching him. Ides said that he still had the nerve to threaten when he himself was in the snare. The demon looked at the person who had spoken those words. He noted her arrogant gait, and something about her seemed familiar. Then he looked into her eyes, scarlet eyes thirsty for blood, and he realized that Ides was in front of him. The first thing he thought was, what had she forgotten in the human world? She walked over to him and placed her hand on his head. Her gaze radiated a demonic light, and she said she'd beat the crap out of him first, and then they'd talk. That look didn't bode well, and the demon began to beg for forgiveness without thinking. And Ides rubbed her hands together, saying that he knew she hated it when children were attacked, didn't he? And the demon said he did, but the second he said he didn't know. Ides rushed to him and grabbed his head again. She asked who else besides him was poisoning their lives. He squealed, justifying that he had no idea. He worked alone. He bowed to her, prostrate on the ground. It didn't look like he was lying, Ides thought. It made sense. Why would he share his power with someone else? Verdie watched Ides and thought she was gorgeous. Ides grabbed his head again and raised it so that she could see his eyes. She asked him why he had come all this way, and yet dared to break the taboo. She doubted that it was unlikely he could have created the seeds, and she asked where did he get them. The demon child was silent. He didn't want to give away his patrons, but the supreme demoness stood before him. She shook him, and said she'd give him a second to think. And at the same moment she counted down. He didn't have to be asked twice. He immediately said that Mr. Hall had given them to him, and said that the demon could use them as long as he wanted. Ides was startled by his answer. She questioningly spoke the name again. Hall was her loyal assistant, the only demon she could trust. He obeyed her every command. Although he was a treacherous snake, but he had a lot of loyalty. That's why the Demon King and the Great Elders also accepted him. Their bond was hundreds of years old, and she had always thought their bond was special. She couldn't believe it. Had Hall betrayed her? She was overcome with anger and rage. She screamed at the demoness for lying and told him that if he didn't want to die right here, he had to tell the truth. But the demon child said it was the purest truth. He suggested she ask anyone. Mr. Hall had recently become the Demon King. This news shook her even more, and she shook the demon again and demanded that he repeat what he had just said. Had she heard what she heard? Had Hall, whom she trusted so much, turned out to be a despicable traitor? Meanwhile, the demoness has pronounced that Mr. Hall has taken the throne and has decided that outdated orders require change. The only thought bouncing around in her head was that it was impossible. Hall had never been interested in power. He was loyal to her more than anything, but he respected the power of a demon king. What happened while she was away? Had Hall overthrown the king? She didn't believe it. The demon stood in front of her, tears streaming from his eyes, begging her to believe him. But Ides still had her doubts. She analyzed that no one would dare infect children without the king's permission. Taboo violations were punishable by death, but she had never dealt with criminals willing to take that risk. A sudden weakness pierced her. So Hall killed the most powerful demon in the underworld and broke a despicable taboo? Suddenly the mark on her arm pulsed and a sharp pain shot through her body. She couldn't handle it. And in a second she collapsed senseless right in front of the dazed demoness. At this time, there was talk in the Lucern Empire that the new saint was behaving suspiciously. The assembled elders were discussing the situation. Someone said that His Majesty had not yet made any comments about her appearance. Another person asked that why would the Baron make such a claim. One of them said that there was a rumor that the whole story of the great saint was nothing more than a fiction of the high priest. But at once another nobleman interceded for the high priest, saying that it was impossible. His Eminence cannot lie. He is the most honest man he has ever known. And some of those present supported this, asking other people not to say rash things. He also added that everyone knows very well the character of His Majesty. He will not forgive the mistakes of even those closest to him and will not believe in empty fictions. And he was backed again. The Baron's concern for the Empire was understandable, but one should not believe groundless rumors. And in the midst of their discussion, another person appeared in the room and asked for permission to clarify the situation. It was Count Mordecai, Verdie's father and an aristocrat who had contributed greatly to the development of the Lucern Empire. The aristocrats gathered round the table greeted the Count, and he suggested that we drop the formalities and get straight to the point. And he said that like everyone else, he trusted His Eminence, so he decided to watch from the sidelines. But he gathered them here for a reason. For the sake of the future of the Empire, they need to discuss a few things. And he said that Saint Verdie had had a prophetic dream, that a powerful demon had appeared and plunged the Empire into chaos. Everyone looked at each other and asked the question, where could such nightmares come from in such a peaceful time? And someone grudgingly said that he had gathered them to discuss the dream. Count Mordecai scratched his chin and pronounced that prophetic dreams were already an important enough topic. But there were bigger problems. The demon from this dream has already infiltrated the Empire. What's more, it's made its way to His Majesty. Someone again expressed doubt, saying he understood the Count's excitement, but should such accusations be made without being sure? And this speech made the Earl terribly angry. His face became stern, and he asked if they thought he would summon them without proof. A tense silence hung in the hall. Everyone was waiting to see what the Count would present to them, and he made a sign to his assistant, and she uttered, "Could someone show her their hand?" One of the young aristocrats came up to her and holding out his hand in front of him said he could. The girl put her hand on his forearm and ran it along it. At that moment a violet glow appeared, and the next moment the man wailed in pain. A network of purple blood vessels had formed on his forearm, penetrating the skin. He shrieked what the hell it was, and the girl smilingly explained that it was a demon seed. Which penetrated the human body and started to feed on it, and after 3 days it tore it apart. All those present in the hall became agitated. Perplexity filled the minds of these people. They did not understand what this seed was, but the Count pronounced that it was not the seeds that were the main threat now, but their owner. There was a pouch in his hands. He fluttered it in the air with a disdainful glance at its contents. Then he poured them out on the table and pronounced that these seeds belonged to a demon who was secretly carrying out the orders of the great saint. Again, everyone was shocked by his words, but someone still asked about how he figured it out. And the Count said that a number of strange incidents had recently occurred in one village. Saint Verdie had been able to cleanse the bodies of the inhabitants of the filth, and the Count added that he was sure everyone had heard about it. And he continued by asking that did they know that the great saint, who had been near her all this time, had had close contact with demons. My Lady Verdie and the villagers witnessed their dialogue. An outcry was heard around the hall, and he added that he believed that the great saint was a fake who had used the seeds to cloud the emperor's mind. And he added that he feared she was up to something terrible. The aristocrats who were still seated jumped to their feet and saying that something like this could not be ignored, decided to immediately capture the demoness and interrogate her. It was necessary to convince His Majesty before it was too late. No one dared to threaten the well-being of the empire. They wanted to take immediate action against her, and the Count, who observed this reaction, was pleased. Ides had a dream. She was a demon again. She was running through the Black Forest through some slum. She was looking for him, Ferdinand. She called out to him, shouting his name. She screamed for him to stop hiding. Suddenly, a sharp pain pierced her heart. Someone from behind had stabbed her in the chest with a blade, sneakily, without warning, and said quietly that she was a cowardly girl. The blood from her heart flowed out and trickled down his sword and arms. She recognized him and asked what he was talking about, and he in turn asked her why she wouldn't kill him. He stood behind her back and talked about how the problem was that she didn't want to do it, and he whispered, asking if she really didn't realize her own feelings. She jumped up on the bed, awake but not yet sure where she was dreaming and where she was real. Breathing hard, she could still feel the pain of his treacherous blow. She tried to chase away the remnants of the dream and thought, what nonsense. Why did she keep dreaming about Ferdinand? When she thought of him, the urge to kill boiled up in her, but she'd forgotten why. She got up and went to the mirror and saw her reflection and thought that maybe she would remember if they fought again. And she thought that if she had wings, she would have rushed to him. She turned her back to the mirror and pulled her dressing gown down to look at her back. She turned her back to the mirror and pulled her robe down to look at her back. She thought, "You can't fly very far on wings like that." At that moment, a maid entered the room with a tray of food in her hands. She had only just said that she had brought the breakfast and stood staring at the naked saint. But the next moment she said that she must dress at once, for His Majesty wished to see her. She helped Ides to dress, and while the maid laced the dress on her back, she asked what he wanted this time. But the maid replied that it was not for her to know, but that the emperor's word was law, and they could not inquire as to his intentions. Ides was beginning to get annoyed. She asked in a sharp tone why the dress was so uncomfortable. The maid, not understanding her mistress's change of mood, began to apologize, though it was not her fault. At that moment something caught her skirt and she looked down and saw a baby at her feet. His appearance surprised her. The baby clung to her legs as if she were familiar to him. Then he raised his head and asked, "Is she the great saint?" He had huge sky-blue eyes and blonde hair. There seemed to be sadness in his eyes. Everyone froze in amazement, and he asked again that she was a great saint. The maid was the first to come to her senses and asked the little one, calling him Your Highness, how long had he been here? From her address, Ides realized that the little one belonged to the imperial family. But he introduced himself to her, saying that his name was Kanan Sigarian, Crown Prince of the Lucern Empire. And he added that everyone just called him Kanan, and immediately asked what her name was. The maid fussed, apologizing to Ides. She said she would sort it out now, intending to take the child away. Ides answered her nothing, but looked at her with a displeased look. Her eyes seemed to blaze with fire. The maid was struck with fear at that look, and she dared not utter another word. She never realized what she had done to anger the lady saint. And Ides squatted down in front of the prince and, smiling at him, said her name was Sally. The little boy repeated her name with surprise. Ides thought he was so cute. A new, unknown feeling swept over her. She didn't want to be angry anymore. The baby repeated her name, shortening it to Sally, and suddenly, spontaneously rushed to her. He hugged her with his little arms, smiling happily, and Ides gave herself over to this new feeling, the joy of the little angel's touch, savoring it. At first she was surprised, but then she pressed the baby against her, savoring the joy that came from the embrace. And suddenly she thought that this world was not so bad. At this moment the emperor entered the room and, seeing this picture, said her name to draw Sally's attention to himself. He looked at her with the same blue eyes as the prince's, but they were austere. He said that it was not the first time he had noticed that she behaved like an angel with children, and he reproached her for her kindness to him. But she looked at him unhappily and replied that it was because it was his face that pissed her off more than anything else. The happiness dissipated. Raiden said that was unfortunate. Her answer made him think. He turned to the maid and told her to take Kanan away, for he wished to speak to the saint in private. The maid immediately rushed to do her monarch's bidding, and Ides reluctantly let go of the baby and rose from her lap and asked, what was this other conversation that required privacy? He didn't go round in circles, and once they were alone, asked directly what she was sent to their world for. Lennox said her purpose was to protect the empire, but he doubted that God could be so merciful as to send him, Raiden, such a beautiful woman. Ides listened to him with her arms crossed over her chest. When he had finished, she said that she had noticed that everyone here believed in God's providence except him. Then she asked him if he had always been an atheist. To this Raiden replied to her that the foundation of this empire was laid by him and his men, not by God. He had to shed rivers of blood and walk through mountains of corpses to reach his goal, and so he gradually lost interest in God. The people ask God for him because he has brought peace to this empire. He has spared them from bloodshed and made it possible for them to live a life of joy. And he summed up with sadness on his face that he had no reason to pray to him. Something deeper was in the depths of his eyes. And then his face regained its sternness, and he asked that he had answered the great saint's question. People are weak and helpless, so they worship those who are stronger than them, trying to beg for happiness or a better fate. And leaders are left to call out to ephemeral beings beyond this world. An extraordinary man stood before her, and she realized that he had a strong spirit, and he had forged that spirit not by a careless life. And smiling, Sally said that she liked his thoughts, and she went on to say that people praise Ferdinand too much. What is the use of a god who can neither be used nor get anything out of him? Her answer surprised Raiden, and he asked incredulously that the saint who appeared from God's garden was asking him to turn away from his faith. Had he understood her correctly? Ides replied that she was only making a point, and that made the emperor laugh. He said that the idea of giving up God and sharing power with her sounded good, but such an ambiguous statement did not make her happy. She asked warily what he was talking about. At this moment a messenger entered the room, and apologizing for interrupting their conversation, addressed His Majesty saying that he brought urgent news. He said that the Chancellor had called an emergency council. Everyone's gathered in the conference room. The ministers are already waiting for him. But Raiden was not happy that they were interrupted and asked irritably, what the hell do they want? This remark made the messenger shift from foot to foot. It was as if he could not say what he had to say. But the emperor was waiting, and so he said that they wanted him to send the great saint away. Hades was taken aback by this message. Even though she didn't want to be in this world, she couldn't go back to her old life either. She hadn't done anything wrong to make people want to get rid of her. Raiden and Eads walked together to the meeting room, servants opening the doors before them. Since it concerned her directly, she went to the meeting too. As they entered the hall, the ministers rose from their seats to salute their monarch. But he cut them off at the half-word and asked why the urgency. Was the empire on the verge of collapse? Ide stood beside him. Her face was covered with a white veil. The Earl of Mordecai took the floor, and apologizing for the disturbance said that he and the gentleman ministers must speak out, even on pain of death. He pointed to Ides, who stood with her head bowed, covered with a white veil, and said that this woman could not be a great saint. He further accused her of being a demoness who was trying to destroy the empire and kill his majesty. The minister seated next to Count Mordecai supported him by saying that they could not ignore Saint Verdie's prophetic dream warning of these events. Someone called her a sneaky liar and demanded that she reveal herself. At these words, as if blown by a breeze, the veil swayed and began to slip from Ida's head. And in the next instant she stood before them all. Ides did not fear to face her accusers. The minister who had called her a liar ahead and froze in place at the piercing gaze that seemed to stare him straight into his soul. The blood-scarlet eyes of the holy maiden wouldn't let him go. The next moment, sighs were heard from different corners of the hall. The holy maiden, the beauty. Her power worked in that ignorant space. Only Count Morticia was immune to her charms. He jumped up from where he was sitting and shouted that she had the power to enchant people's hearts, and demanded that the ministers come to their senses. But seeing that nothing could be done, he approached the emperor and told him that he believed she was a demon, and added that he had solid proof of this theory. He raised the hand in which he held the sack and said that it contained the seeds they had seized from the demon caught the other day. Eads watched tensely as he shook the bag, and the count said he had a witness who could confirm how the false saint had spoken to him. She walked up to the count and the emperor and snatched the sack from his hands, saying that they were just fools who didn't realize the seriousness of the consequences that could happen if these seeds were lost. The bag burst open and was empty. The count could not believe that it was empty. It was as if he had forgotten how he himself had shaken out those seeds in front of the ministers. But he kept insisting, blurting out that he could swear there were 5 seeds in there. Ides said angrily that if she didn't get rid of those seeds, they would be sucked into the first child she saw, and there would be no saving him. She turned to the emperor and asked if there were any children in the palace. He said anxiously that there were only Canaan in the palace. She scrambled up and, throwing him on the run that things were bad and telling him to call the high priest and follow her, rushed for the exit. The ministers began to panic. They asked what should they do. If His Highness Canaan had been harmed, they would not be able to tear their heads off. But Count Mordecai continued to stand his ground, saying that this woman was not a saint. But when the minister asked him with great doubt, what did he think a demon would do to help Prince Canaan? Then the count became furious. His face contorted with anger and he growled, "How many times must he say it?" He mouthed that she was undoubtedly a demon, and added that those red eyes could not belong to a saint. He too went to the exit, saying before he did that he would immediately start looking for more evidence. She ran down the corridor, a bad feeling pushing her forward. The emperor could barely keep up with her and shouted at her to turn left, that Canaan's quarters would be at the end of the corridor. She hurried as fast as she could and said words like a prayer that everything would be all right. For some reason she remembered the moment when the emperor had first called her Sally, and it had stirred some long-forgotten feeling in her soul. She felt the same excitement now as she had then. What could it mean? She bit her lip, trying to figure out why she cared about this child. They ran to the door of the prince's room in a flash. Sally grasped the knob and yanked it open. In the center of the room, hanging in the air, was Canaan, and from his body wriggled some kind of creeper with many tentacles. The floor was stained with his blood. The maid sat on that floor, stained with blood too. Sally stiffened and pronounced that it was worse than she had realized. All 5 seeds had clung to him. The high priest, who came running after them, asked in horror that this monster was His Highness the Prince. At that moment, the monster swung its tentacle at Sally and the priest. She managed to dodge, and Lennox was in a lot of trouble. He lost his balance for a while. He couldn't recover. She ran away shouting for them not to provoke the monster, and it was striking at her, trying to catch up with her. Ides was frantically thinking of what to do. If she had the strength, she would have dealt with it in no time. Dodging another blow, she thought there was no way out. And turning towards where the emperor and the guards stood, she shouted for her sword to be thrown. Raiden reacted with lightning speed, taking the sword from the guard and throwing it to Sally. It slammed into her right next to her feet, and now she could fight back or do something instead of just running away while the monster tore through the boy's body. She struck again and again, chopping off chunks of long tentacles that grew back again and again. But the forces were unequal, and at some point this beast had her neck wrapped around it. Another blow and another part of the long tentacle fell to the floor, freeing Ides from that death grip. But the next moment she did not have time to dodge, and from the strong blow she got a wound and blood started to ooze out of it. Ides looked at the drops of scarlet blood that were falling to the floor at her feet. Suddenly the picture switched. She remembered herself wounded but from another life. Tears flowed from her eyes and a feeling of hopelessness came to her heart. She woke up from that unpleasant sensation, as if it were an obsession. But the memory clung to that moment like a string. But she couldn't remember what those memories were. They eluded her again and again. The mutant rushed towards her again, delivering another blow. Ides realized that her strength was leaving her and she wouldn't be able to resist for long. But from her last efforts, she repelled this blow as well, cutting that monstrous tentacle as well. The Emperor shouted to her to get ready. She was good with a sword, but she couldn't do it alone, so he drew his sword from its sheath and prepared to fight. Somewhere from inside, the head of this terrifying mutant appeared. Its eyes and maw burned with fire. Raiden asked Seely, wondering what they should do. Could they still save Kanan? And she replied that the odds were 50-50. She was getting weaker, but managed to say that to kill this mutant you have to aim for the head. Then the Emperor turned to Lennox and demanded that he place a barrier on Seely to protect her, and the priest immediately complied. She felt as if she were in a viscous cocoon. She asked the Emperor what he was up to, and he said he would save both her and Kanan. His determination inspired faith and his words sounded like a vow. He tried to get as close to the monster as possible. He put one arm out in front of him and held the other arm with his sword out to strike. Seely saw this and shouted fearfully that it could be dangerous, but he concentrated on his goal. His gaze was dispassionate and determined. One precise movement and blood flew in all directions, staining the floor and the walls and the people in the room. A mutant head fell at the Emperor's feet. Its eyes were fading, taking the danger with them. The Emperor put his palm forward and a dense ring of light began to form around it. He pointed it at the mutant body that continued to wrap around Kanan's body. Glowing circles of energy began to emanate from his palm. The priest remarked in amazement that it was time-stopping magic. It was the first time he had ever seen their Emperor use any kind of magic. He knew that His Majesty was the sole wielder of magic in the imperial family, but he thought he was squeamish about using it. Ides also thought that it was rare to meet someone who could control time, much less a person, but that wasn't even what was strange to her. She couldn't believe her eyes. Raiden was using God Ferdinand's powers. Had he really? The world is ruled by 4 gods. One of them is Ferdinand, who created the magic of stopping time. Not even the magic of controlling the natural elements can match it in sophistication. Only a few among the gods can use it, but even they will never reach Ferdinand's level. Raiden's control of her flow is perfect. It's incredible. And her doubts about him being human flickered again. She thought again, what other connection there was between them, other than the fact that they were similar in appearance. The high priest shouted anxiously if His Highness was all right and rushed over to the child, who lay emotionless on the floor. He bent over Kanan. Ides was distracted from her thoughts of Ferdinand and asked how Kanan was too, but she could not move from her seat. She pressed her hand to the wound and held on with all her strength. The wound on her stomach continued to bleed, and with each drop of blood she lost, she was losing the last of her strength. The priest put his hand on the child's chest and heard a faint but clear heartbeat beneath it. The priest put his hand on the child's chest and heard a faint but clear heartbeat underneath. Those words were the last she heard. A foggy haze enveloped her consciousness. She didn't say it, but she thought she was glad, and collapsed senseless to the floor. She heard someone call out to Seely somewhere far away, someone say Lady Saint, but the voices grew distant until they were no longer audible at all. The day was unusually sunny. Its rays were warm. The ground was carpeted with green grass and various flowers, and in this fairy tale meadow she was walking. She wore a lush white dress with a long skirt fluttering round her legs. She was happy. Yes, that feeling was happiness. She was smiling and laughing merrily. Happiness was overwhelming her. The old grandmother that was wrapped up sitting on a stump and basking in the sun said that she looked pleased. Seely turned to her and said happily that she didn't think she had ever been so happy. Her hands rested on her rounded belly because of the pregnancy. The old woman said that she was about to give birth for the 8th time, and she was as happy as the first time. Seely replied that it was their baby, so how could she not be happy? The old woman closed her eyes as if in pleasure, and said that there was no other couple like them anywhere. So many years together, and still close. Seely laughed happily again. It was happiness, and she felt it physically, as if she held it in her hands and was ready to share it with the whole world. She noticed a man walking in the distance. It was the man who made her happy. Seely said, "There he is," and she raised her hand up and waved it and shouted that they were here, that he'd come soon. Grandma asked again. She loved him so much, and Seely said she loved him immensely, so much so that she didn't even know how to express it properly. Again she heard voices, but they were of a different tone. They drew closer and became clearer until she heard someone calling out to the Lady Saint. Someone was asking her to wake up. She opened her eyes with a feeling of emptiness, as if she had lost something. Something important. I think she was dreaming about something. The memory brought her back to reality. She remembered how the Emperor had used time-stopping magic. She sprang up on the bed and repeated Kanan's name anxiously. The sudden movement made her wounded side ache. She pressed her palm against it and grimaced. Then she remembered the priest leaning over the baby, checking its heartbeat, and wistfully pronounced that he was unhurt. Someone was hurriedly approaching her bed. Then a worried exclamation was heard. It was the Emperor. He was asking how she was. He had a look of genuine concern on his face. She was silent, and he moved closer to stroke her head and said that her sword skills surprised him, but her stamina amazed him even more. A normal human would have died, but Saeli replied that there was nothing to be surprised about. She had almost died too, as he could see. But the Emperor said that she was recovering quickly. She looked at her hand and asked how long had she been asleep. Raiden said she'd been asleep for 3 days, and he was beginning to fear she wouldn't wake up. He gently took her hand and pronounced that the death of a saint sent by God would affect him and the Empire as a whole. And besides, he paused and said that losing such a beautiful woman was something he would regret for the rest of his life. Such encounters happen only once. Saeli stared at him. What was this confession? It also bothered her that as soon as she looked at Raiden, her heart started to go crazy. And that was starting to piss her off again. She glared at him and said angrily that she was not his thing, and it was up to her to stay here or leave. He looked at her puzzled, and she asked him a question, and without waiting for an answer asked him how he had managed to master the magic of stopping time. He crossed his arms over his chest and said that as a child he had to learn everything himself, including magic. He crossed his arms and said that as a child he had to learn everything himself, including magic. Raiden pronounced that by no means it wasn't quite easy. Did she ask about him being a man for sure? Her eyes looked at him questioningly, trying to discern the slightest hint of a lie on his part, and she asked, "What is he hiding?" He didn't look away. There was a fire in the depths of his sky-blue eyes, and it was as if that light had been familiar to her for a long time. He wanted to say something, but at that moment Priest Lennox looked out from behind him and pronounced that His Majesty was a fine man, and he apologized for interrupting them and asked how the Lady Saint was feeling. Saeli assured him that everything was fine, and she said that there were more important matters at hand. Suddenly, Kanan ran up to her bed and stretched out his arms towards her. He was alarmed. He asked if she was still in pain, but she smilingly assured him that everything was fine. He climbed onto her bed and hugged her with his body. The baby told her to get well soon. She felt a warm wave of love from that sincere wish. A woman's voice came from the doorway and said that it was true, but the saint needed rest to recover. A young, pale woman stood in the doorway. She had the same blue eyes and blonde hair as the child. Saeli asked the woman who came in who she was, and she said her name was Bella Wish. She's Kanan's mother, and she thanked Saeli for saving her boy's life. Saeli asked in surprise that she was Kanan's mother, and Bella answered in the affirmative again, adding that she had done a poor job in that role, failing to keep him safe. Saeli said that he looked more like Raiden than her, because most human children look like their fathers. But Raiden said that Kanan was a member of the Imperial family, and he was like a son to him. But he was not his father. And seeing the confusion on Saeli's face, he added that Kanan was his older brother's son. After the death of the former emperor, he was to take his throne. Raiden was silent. It was obvious that he was uncomfortable with the conversation, but he continued, saying that 4 years ago, when the war broke out, he had simply fled. Saeli got angry and said it was disgusting. How dare he abandon his own child, and where is he now? Raiden replied that who knows. He thought he was just embarrassed to look people in the eye. Even if he comes back, it's not a fact that he will live long. Many people want him dead, and he, Raiden, is no exception. Bella said that she was glad that Kanan was so attached to the great saint. Saeli was surprised by this and asked why Bella said that. And Bella sadly said that she was ill and would soon be gone. Perhaps tomorrow she would see her baby Kanan for the last time. Saeli noted that she looked really tired and pale. Saeli looked at the boy that clung to her and asked Bella reproachfully, what had she decided to spend this time she had left on self-pity? She has to do everything she can to live as long as possible. Saeli asked thoughtfully, what did Bella say was 1 day left? And then pronounced her not to bullshit. Bella listened to her and tears rolled down her cheeks as Saeli continued to say that instead of thinking about death, she needed to think about how to fill each day with happiness. And Bella agreed with her. To be honest, she didn't want to leave Kanan and say goodbye to her life. She thanked the great saint for her support and said that she felt much better now. And it was all thanks to her. She went to her bedside and said that Saeli needed rest, so she was taking Kanan away. Then she asked that the saint rest properly. She was leaving and already standing in the doorway. Turning round, she smiled and said goodbye, hoping to see her again soon. They remained in the room, the 3 of them, with the emperor and the priest, and Saeli turned to Lennox and asked him if Verdie could not cure her of her illness. But he said that unfortunately no one could cure Mrs. Bella. While they had sought help outside the Empire, the disease had reached an incurable stage. Saeli stared in front of her, and as if in space asked the question, did the great saint have a chance to help? Lennox thought for a moment, and then he said that according to records, one of the great saints had incredible healing powers, and there is no proof of this. It is said that she cured the king of a deadly disease and saved the kingdom from imminent disaster. And then he asked her why she was asking. Did the saint want to try to heal Mrs. Bella? But she said she could not do it now. But the priest asked again why she was asking then. And Sally, smiling enigmatically, replied that she had an idea. At this time, Verdie went to her father's house to talk to him. She asked him why he had arranged all this. But Count Mordecai stood with his back to her, and as if he did not know what she was talking about, he asked her what she meant, and she told him not to pretend he didn't understand. And she added that it was chaos in the capital now. Verdie accused her father of putting Mr. Raiden and Mrs. Seeley in danger. She also called her a demoness. She also added that she had only shared with him her thoughts that without the ability to cleanse her body of impurities, she could hardly be called a saint. But Count Morticia, still not turning to his daughter, pronounced that he assures her that behind the mask of a saint, there is a demonic creature. He also said that their family could have achieved unprecedented heights. Their status in society would have risen immediately if Verdie had become a great saint and married His Majesty. And this woman ruined it for them. He turned his head slightly in her direction, and grudgingly said that therefore the great saint should be her, Verdie, and no one else. But Verdie didn't seem to understand what her father was saying, and continued to stand her ground, saying that she wouldn't mind giving the place to Sally. The Earl's tone changed, rage swirling in him, but he held back. He turned to his daughter, apparently to see if she was in her right mind. He asked in surprise what she meant by that, and Verdie, smiling reverently, asked if he had seen the saint in action, and reverently added that if she remained in the imperial palace, she would be near her, serving and assisting her. The Count couldn't bear it. The rage he had been holding back came out. He slapped Verdie without hesitation. The girl, from the surprise and force of the blow, lost her balance and fell to the floor. She had known him for years and couldn't believe her father had done this to her. Verdie held her hand to her flaming cheek and looked at him perplexed, and the Count put his hands behind his back and mouthed that he would not hear such a thing from her again. He resented it. How much effort had he put into making her a great saint, and she wanted a place as a mere servant. She had graduated from the Saint Academy with honors. To whom did she owe her honors? Verdie trembled at his obvious aggression, but still asked what he was talking about. And the Earl, looking fiercely at his daughter, growled that did she really think that the gifted girl named Rosaine had died her death? Verdie remembered the young girl, her classmate at the Holy Academy, Rosaine. The meaning of her father's words came slowly to her, and she was horrified. She could not believe this terrifying reality and said that he was lying. And the Earl asked her a question. Did she really think that God had chosen her? And said that it was he, her father, who had bestowed upon her the noble name of the Mordecus family. He couldn't control his rage, so he walked over to Verdie and put his arm round her neck, squeezing it, making her gasp. And to make her learn her lesson, he said that God had not chosen her, but he had. He let go of her throat and said in a voice that was calm, but not objectionable, that she should rise above the entire empire. It was exactly what he expected her to do. He stroked her head and said calmly, as if he hadn't just mocked her, not to worry, that he would get rid of the demoness and give her back her title. He asked her to obey him and not to cross him. At this time, Sally was in her room and said that she felt much better now, but her arm was still bothering her. She reached for a piece of paper from the high priest and decided to see what he had written to her. There was a list of kind phrases, sort of short blessings like, "Thank you from the bottom of my heart. May Ferdinand's blessing be with you," or "She and Great Ferdinand exist to bring you good," or like Great Ferdinand, it was enough for her that they keep the thought of her in their hearts. And at the end it meant that any phrase she had to end with the words that she loved everyone. The message made her boil like a volcano about to erupt into lava. She could never have thought of such a thing, and he was suggesting that she express herself in such a way. And she crumpled up his note with such force as if she had the head of the one who had written it in her hands, and was thus taking out all her anger on her. And then she threw the lump with force into the fire burning in the fireplace. Just then he entered the room and said he had good news, and an annoyed Sally asked him if it was true. And he said he didn't know what kind of wood she had, but the fireplace was burning. And then he said he'd found the records of the old Saint Rena. Sally asked animatedly if it said anything about the power of healing, and Lennox said that it probably did, and added that they had found them in the descendants of the lady. But he added that there was one problem, and Sally asked anxiously, what was the problem? The descendants of the lady consider the empire and the emperor himself their enemies. They also claim that the people of Lucern illegally deprived them of the status of saints, and they not only don't pay any taxes, but also loot the neighboring villages. So it will be difficult to come to an agreement with them. But Sally wasn't listening to him anymore. Her eyes lit up with gambling fire, and she said that then they would play by their rules and rob them. She rode in a carriage dressed in expensive clothes and decked out in precious jewelry. It was part of her plan. The high priest was in the carriage with her, and he asked her warily if she was sure of her decision. Wouldn't they incur the wrath of God if they plundered? But Sally replied that they were following in the footsteps of the great saint's descendants, so what was wrong with that? And the records were of no use to them, so… She was silent, and the priest said that in a way she was right, but suddenly Sally interrupted him and asked him if he had ever met Ferdinand. Without waiting for an answer, she said that she had known him for so long that she knew him like the back of her hand. She imagined the mighty white-winged god of war Ferdinand invisibly giving his blessing, and she said that he had not chosen her to be a great saint for nothing. And her eyes lit up again with scarlet fire. And to convince the priest with certainty, she added that everything she was doing could be considered Ferdinand's own will. The priest thought for a moment and said, "That's how it is." Then he asked that she wouldn't mind if he asked a personal question, and did Sally tell him to ask? The priest looked her straight in the eye and asked her what their relationship was. Sally was immediately even taken aback and asked what he meant. Her and Ferdinand? A slight shadow fell over her face and she said that she didn't even know how to describe it. After a little silence, she continued by saying that for 120,000 years she had been chasing him, and he had been chasing her. The priest asked in astonishment that she had been pursuing God for 120,000 years. He suddenly realized that he was halfway through the journey, and that it was time to stop for a rest. And Sally said, "Why did people have to invent carriages when they could just fly across the sky?" But the priest was busy with his own thoughts. He thought that the lady saint was unrequitedly in love with God Ferdinand. It was an unprecedented discovery for him. And looking at her, he thought, who would have thought it? Sally had gone out for air during the rest stop, for she was quite seasick in the carriage. She stood on a large boulder and breathed deeply, while the wind blew around her face and fluttered her hair. And enjoying the breeze, she said that carriages were not hers after all. At that moment, Verdie came up to her with a tray with a bowl of soup on it. She sat down nearby and said that they had been looking for her, and she had brought her some food. But Sally replied that why all the excitement? She was just getting some fresh air. She added, however, that she was really hungry. Sally took the soup that Verdie had brought and asked her why she had come with them. Verdie, smiling good-naturedly, said that she had wanted to accompany the saint, and with His Majesty's permission, she too had traveled, and added that from that moment she would be her faithful servant. Sally said that it was clear to her and asked Verdie not to cook for her. Verdie herself was looking at the saint in awe, thinking without noticing anything that she was beautiful. Sally looked at her and asked her that it wasn't her cooking, was it? And seeing that Verdie didn't answer, she asked her if she was listening to her at all. And Verdie, continuing her blissful contemplation of the saint, thought that even sitting in such a rough posture she still retained her dignity. And then she caught herself and assured her that she hadn't cooked anything else. Last time Sally hadn't been happy with her skills, and Sally noted that it had taken her a long time to realize. Verdie looked at her and thought, what if her father was right, and Mrs. Seeley is actually a demon? She remembered how he had put a bottle in her hands and told her to let the demoness drink it. Verdie didn't dare to contradict him, but asked if it was poison. But her father told her that it was holy water infused with the power of the priest's prayers. It would do no harm to a man, but it would burn a demon from the inside out. And he added confidently that she would soon see for herself that the woman was a demon. His gaze hypnotized and paralyzed the will, and Verdie could not resist. Sally scooped soup from the bowl with a spoon and pronounced that this world would be safer if Verdie didn't touch the food. Verdie was nervous because she had secretly added holy water to the soup, but now she doubted she had done the right thing. What if her father had deceived her? And when she saw Sally bring the spoonful of soup to her mouth, her nerves failed, and she thought she couldn't do that to Sally. She shouted for Sally not to eat the soup. And to explain her behavior, she said that the soup was still hot and advised her to wait until it cooled down. But Sally pronounced that her stomach couldn't wait and tasted the soup. Verdie first shouted for her to be careful, then rushed to run away. Her behavior surprised Sally. She wondered why she was so nervous. Had she decided to become an actress? But she didn't have time to think about it. At that moment, something big rushed at her from behind the bushes, and she only had time to cover herself with her hands from the attack. A man stood in front of her. He didn't attack Sally. He said he was waiting for Verdie to leave and left Sally alone, and he asked that she was from the Imperial Palace, right? He was a big man, and he said he would take Sally to the village and threatened her to be quiet. Apparently, he didn't want to hurt her. After a while, the priest reprimanded Verdie that how could she have left Sally alone? She had disappeared. She was nowhere to be found, and he asked Verdie where to look for her now. But Verdie apologized, saying that she had only gone away for a minute, and when she came back she was gone. The emperor stood with his arms crossed over his chest. He said he had sent orders to the Lord of the Lands to close all roads and checkpoints. He ordered the priest to get everyone he could to join the search, and he went to do his bidding immediately. Verdie tearfully wondered what might have happened to the holy maiden. She remembered what her father had said about holy water burning demons from the inside out. She remembered what her father had said about holy water burning demons from the inside out. One of the guards came up to them and said that they had found footprints of a man on a rock, not far from where the saint had disappeared. And he added that the footprints showed that it was a grown man. The emperor hesitated and said that this was not like the behavior of an ordinary man. But the priest immediately asked that why anyone would kidnap the lady saint. But the emperor turned away and went on his way, asking, "Is the village where the descendants of Saint Raina live near here?" And the priest, following him, replied that it was. The emperor jumped up on his horse and pronounced that the empire was their enemy. Perhaps by kidnapping someone from the imperial family, they planned to blackmail them, and he said that whatever the case, we should try to find them on the trail. He began to give out orders, saying that Lennox would go with him and let the knights saddle their horses and search the area. The others were to stay and wait here. Verdie clutched her hands to her chest. In her head, all she could think about was that it was her fault that Mistress Saley. She shook. Her father's voice sounded in her head, saying that he would definitely get rid of the demoness and give her back her title. She was sinking into darkness. His words about the gifted girl Rosanne not dying of her own accord. She had just listened to her father and not crossed him. She didn't know what she should do now. A stout man stood on the platform. He raised his clenched fist upwards and the crowd in front of him fell silent, listening to what he had to say. And he said that their hour had come. They, the descendants of a great family, had been pushed to the very edge of the empire. It was time the world learnt of them. His sullen face was framed by blonde hair that peeked out from under a bandana, and an equally blonde beard braided into 3 pigtails. He said that Badam would soon bring a member of the imperial family. In exchange for him, they would return the rights they had lost. At that moment, someone said that Badam had returned, and pointed his finger in the direction from which the man was walking heavily. It was obvious that he was very tired. He was also carrying someone on his back, and it must have been a heavy burden. The people looked at their Badam and could not understand what was wrong with his face. They had never seen him like this before. When he got close enough, Saley, who had been sitting on his back, jumped down to the ground and with her arms at her sides, stood in full glory before the crowd. She looked round the crowd and asked if the descendants of the great saint lived here. The people looked at her incredulously. She was not frightened or confused, on the contrary. She was confident and strong, as if she felt that she was not a kidnapped captive, but a mistress. Badam, who had brought it, stood silently behind her back. Suddenly, an irritated voice came from the crowd. It was the man in charge who had spoken before, and he shouted that Badam was an idiot. They wanted a member of the imperial family, not a saint. What are they going to do with her now? Badam bowed his head sorrowfully, and trying to justify himself began to mumble something unintelligible. He tried to say that he was so eager to favor the head, to be recognized at last for his help, to be praised for the good he had done, that he had grabbed the most beautiful and expensively dressed girl. He was riddled with surprise when his captive suddenly commanded him to stand, then made claims that she was in pain and demanded that he carry her on his back. He was dumbfounded. After all, he thought he had knocked out the prisoner. When had she woken up? And yet he had the audacity to demand something. She was strong enough to jump on his back and put her hand round his neck, saying that he had hoped to stun her with such a weak blow. And she added that he was making her head hurt, and then demanded that he carry her on his back. Badam was already starting to turn blue from choking, and Saley kept thanking him for making it easy for her and coming after her. And all he could think about was, how did she get so strong? Saley complained that traveling in a carriage made her body ache. She threatened to kill him on the spot if he made a move or took her the wrong way. And he mumbled that he understood as long as she loosened her grip. When he finished his story, the head swore and said again that he was a moron. Then he turned to Saley and said that they didn't need a saint as a hostage, so she could rest assured that no harm would come to her. But Saley said that he seemed to be in charge and asked if he had heard of Saint Raina. The man crossed his arms over his chest and said that the name of Saint Raina was sacred to each of them, and of course he knew of her. Great Saint Raina saved the king from death and helped the common people. Magnificent, humble, generous, beautiful, it seemed he would never tire of listing her virtues. But that wasn't why Saley had come here. She threw her palm forward and stopped him, saying enough was enough, and then asked him to tell her about the legacy of Saint Raina. The man led her to the local library and opened the doors and let her enter, saying that it was the first time he had met a saint with such noble aims, and so he was prepared to show her the things of Saint Raina. Saley looked around, and the man said that not everyone could be so honored, and added that she could be proud of it. But Saley's head was busy with other thoughts, and she couldn't concentrate on what he was saying. She just needed to figure out how to activate the healing power. She was a little discouraged by what she saw. Would all these books have to be reread? The man said with his hands spread apart that they were all diaries of Mrs. Raina, describing her life before she became a great saint. And he added that she could read as much as she wanted, but she had to be careful. Saley wanted to scream. Is he kidding? She couldn't handle this much in her life. She scratched the top of her head and pronounced that it would be difficult and she would need help. But the man said that Mrs. Reina had accomplished many feats in her life, so it would take her some time to read her memoirs. He added that she should take her time, and that he should wait outside. Sally opened the first book she saw, thinking she was doing it for Bella. She was surprised that the text was printed on such high-quality paper, but after reading a few entries, she realized that it was printed on gibberish. And she slammed the book shut, thinking that why bother herself when she could dump all the work on the priest? She stepped out of the vault to get some fresh air, but on the street she suddenly felt sick. She felt dizzy and her headache got much worse. She stretched out her palm in front of her to focus her gaze on it and thought, why still no headache? At that moment, a man shouted at the top of his voice somewhere very close by. He was informing the head that the knights were on their way, and she thought with annoyance that this was all she needed. But the next moment she thought they'd shown up just in time. At least they'd help move those books. The man said in a loud voice, "Are these really the Emperor's servants?" But another man replied that they were on white horses, and it was obvious that they were subordinate to the highest nobility. "But there's no time to find out who. We must leave immediately." First among all appeared the high priest on his white horse, and he shouted with all his might that the lady saint was here. The locals were annoyed that the uninvited guests had arrived so quickly. They didn't know what to do, so the leader ordered them to get away. But at that moment other riders came from the other side and announced that everyone was surrounded, so it was pointless to flee. It was Emperor Raiden himself. He dismounted from his horse and decided to see for himself what was going on. His guard tried to stop his monarch, saying that they would sort it out themselves and that His Majesty could rely on them. But he raised his hand to stop him and said that he would take care of it himself. The man who was in charge gawked at himself, not believing that the Emperor himself was standing in front of him. He asked in surprise what he was doing here, and added that they were expecting someone from the imperial family, not the Emperor himself. And embarrassed, he asked what had brought the Emperor himself to such a wilderness. But the Emperor looked at him with a stern look and said that they had stolen his great saint. And he asked in an equally stern tone, did they really think they could get away with it? But the man rolled his eyes to heaven and said that they didn't know she was a great saint. They thought she was just an ordinary saint. But the Emperor was adamant. He said that as citizens of the empire they had broken the law, and since they had plundered before, they should be punished. And he drew his sword and raised it upwards. But the man tried to justify himself by saying that His Majesty knew that they lived in a mountainous area where almost nothing could be grown. They were just trying to survive. The Emperor hummed and said that did they think that after such an excuse he would turn a blind eye to their evil deeds. And he asked the man, why would he enter into their situation? He's not in the charity business. The villagers know how valuable grain is in this area. The man gulped for air, not knowing what else to say in his defense. Other residents began to gather behind him, and the Emperor went on to say that robbery here is equivalent to murder. That's a pretty serious offense, isn't it? The man couldn't say a word. He had nothing to say for himself. The Emperor looked at these men and said that every one of them would be quartered. And after these words, a plea for pardon went up through the crowd. It took Raiden a second to realize what these men were. The way the leader shuddered at his words didn't escape his inquisitive gaze. And he said there were so many it would take a long time, and he added that it would be better then. And pausing, he swung his sword. The leader, who was standing right beside him, thought that now he was the first to be killed, that his hour had come, and that the execution would take place right now. He screamed and instinctively covered his head with his hands. But the Emperor put his sword back in its scabbard, and when the frightened leader calmed down and realized that his life was not in danger, he said that he would send the whole village to serve a life sentence. And the leader, not believing his ears, asked again that they would not be executed. The Emperor glanced at him and asked, "Is this what he wanted?" But the man immediately replied that he didn't. He was just surprised. The high priest intervened in their dialogue and asked permission to explain the situation, as His Majesty is a bit verbal and the inhabitants do not understand what awaits them. And he coughed and said that the Emperor wished the inhabitants to pay for their crimes not with their lives, but with their labor. Therefore, they will be given the fertile lands of the south where they can grow fruits and vegetables to feed their families and earn a living. The villagers rejoiced, and the priest added that they would cultivate the land. Part of the harvest would go to feed them, and the rest would be given to the needy. He also warned them that they would have to work hard, but they would not starve. The people could not believe their luck. They kept asking if they would really be given land. Someone said that he thought he would have to fight for a piece of bread all his life. Sally was watching all of this on the sidelines. The headache wouldn't go away. And when she heard about the punishment the villagers would receive, she thought irritably that she hadn't expected anything else from the Emperor. The man fell on his knees before the Emperor and said that they would never forget his kindness. But the Emperor didn't listen to him anymore. He turned and walked towards where Sally was standing. He was followed by the priest. He said that the village had been in hopeless decline for years and he had saved it in the blink of an eye. His voice was full of admiration and pride in his Emperor. He continued that he thought the emperor would not interfere and would leave as soon as the saint was done with her business. But Raiden replied that he preferred to be efficient. After all, if he killed them, they'd all be in trouble. The priest said that he would never tire of repeating that His Majesty's actions were worthy of the Lord of Lucern. And the emperor, in turn, said that Lennox spoke so cheerfully of it, though he knew how he, Raiden, hated to hear such things. The priest couldn't resist saying that Her late Majesty the Empress would have been proud of him. And that mention pricked Raiden's heart. His gaze became thoughtful. He remembered a young, smiling woman. She had called his name, his mum. She loved him and was proud of his every success. But his memory immediately brought back his father's tough and demanding manner, and he thought that his father would never have shown that he was proud of him. The priest noticed the change in the emperor's mood and wanted to say something else to him, but Raiden dryly muttered that he'd better not anger him any further. And Lennox stopped to think what had put his emperor in such a bad temper. He was a mystery to him. He looked at the departing monarch and thought that he had never fully understood this man. He was secretive and not verbose. Sally sat under a tree, annoyed that this headache was killing her. With her previous strength, she would have got where she needed to go quickly and without any carriages. Everything is not going the way she wants it to. Moreover, it's worth relaxing as her wrist was starting to burn. And she closed her eyes and thought what a weak body she'd got. And that made it all the more frustrating. At that moment, Raiden came up to her. He could see that she wasn't feeling well, so he put his hand to her forehead, checking for fever. She opened her eyes and looked at him, but her gaze was absent, as if she were looking through him. Raiden said she didn't seem to be feeling well, but he called her by name, and she looked at him and could not understand where reality ended and the mirage began. Standing beside the emperor was he, Ferdinand, the god of war. They looked like twins. She stood up sharply. She wanted to grab him to get even with him, but the vision vanished. The emperor stood in front of her and she leaned against a tree and replied that she was fine, and asked what about healing magic. The emperor, looking at Sally studyingly, said, "What about this? They are looking for a spellbook." Under the watchful eye of the high priest, the people from the village and all those who had come with the emperor were rereading and sorting through the books. The priest kept asking them to push a little harder. The people were already howling from the strain and complaining that there were so many strange things written, and he said that it would take an indefinite time to check all the books. So he suggested she get some more rest. Raiden assured her he'd let her know when they were done. Sally agreed with him, and he went to the priest while she remained standing under the tree watching him. She sat down again and exhaled in exhaustion. Sally thought it was so quiet here. Nothing distracted her from her thoughts. The thought occurred to her that perhaps trying to remember the reason for her desire for revenge against Ferdinand was pointless. She remembered her former life, when she had power in her hands. She thought that she might have lost her strength and skills. But to take someone's life, it was enough to be fearless and have a fighting spirit. But she remembered another feeling. Thanks to the friendly and ever-smiling people of the Lucern Empire ... It seemed as if the serenity could last forever. She looked at them and thought that she had already forgotten that warm feeling of being cared for and supported by loved ones. Sally was in the shade of a spreading tree. She closed her eyes and thought it had been a long time since she'd felt this relaxed. Bliss filled her and she smiled at her thoughts. Finally, after a hard day of traveling, Sally was in her room at the palace and the ordeal was over. She collapsed exhausted into her bed and said she hated carriages. The maid standing beside her said that she understood that the lady was tired, but reminded her that she had an important visitor waiting for her. Sally could not endure this torture any longer and turned to the maid and said that she wanted to sleep, and that if he wanted anything, he should come himself. But the maid said that all men, except His Majesty and His Eminence, were forbidden to enter her chamber. Sally said grumpily that it was a lot of trouble, but the maid did not say a word. Sally walked down the corridor with the last of her strength, wondering what he needed at this hour. Maybe they had found a healing spell. She went to the door and pushed it open with the palms of both hands. She entered the room. The room was dark with only the flame of a candle flickering in some of the candlesticks. A man with long red hair stood in the middle of the room with his back to her. Sally wondered if he had called out to her. The man turned his face towards her, and in the candlelight his eyes glittered with a familiar sly gleam. Sally lunged at it with fury, knocking it to the floor with the elbow of her hand. It was a demon with 2 twisted horns on its head. She looked into his eyes and asked, "Since when did a dream demon dare give her orders?" The demon was smiling slyly at her. There was something in his gaze. Suddenly he called her Sally, then touched his hand to her forehead and asked in a familiar voice what had gotten into her. Sally was surprised none of the demons had ever called her that. And that voice? He called her Sally again and said he couldn't breathe. Sally looked up and saw the emperor in front of her, whom she knocked down and pinned to the floor. She was surprised. Was she hallucinating and mistaking the emperor for a dream demon? He gently tried to push her away and asked her to stop pushing him. But Sally grinned and thought that the dream demon had peeked into her memories and taken the form of the emperor. Had she concluded that he was her weak point? Suddenly, her hand seemed to squeeze the Emperor's body where the heart had been, and blood splattered in all directions, staining Sally's hands and face and clothes. Sally mockingly said that the dream demon might not make her laugh, and added that did he really think he could control her with that much power? The dream demon coughed. A trickle of blood flowed from his mouth, and he said, "Is this how Ides greets an old friend? Putting on a bloody show?" Ides was stunned again. That voice. Her eyes rounded and she spoke the name of someone she considered her trusted friend in the world of dark forces. It was Hall. She remembered how they were black demons and he always stood behind her back. He'd said he missed her. Ides got to her feet and said in a reproachful tone that he'd had a good time, betraying her, killing the Demon King. And, she asked, was he ready to be punished? But he stretched out the word with surprise. Amusement? And then pronounced that he was merely fulfilling a part in waiting for her. But Ides was adamant. She angrily told him not to make her laugh, for he had shown his true face. And she added that it must have been difficult for him to pretend for so long. He was flattered by her concern for his feelings, but he paused, then said that she'd had a harder time of it, because in 120,000 years she'd never been able to kill Ferdinand. And she had forgotten the truth about her past. Ciri shrieked at what the truth was, and demanded that he spill everything he knew about it. But he rolled his eyes and said that all in good time. And he said goodbye until I see Ides again soon. She remained sitting in the dark room. Ides had not expected to meet Hall. She realized that she couldn't get her strength back at once. She would have to find another way. And she thought that she might not be able to kill Hall. But she had to survive. Some time passed. Seelie, the priest, and a few other temple attendants were holding a class in the garden. Seelie was learning magic. Once again, the priest praised her for her amazingly fast learning of magic. But Seelie replied that it wasn't difficult and asked curiously, "What next?" She was driven by impatience. The priest smiled and replied that she was getting the new material easily, but that she should not rush into it. It was noon, and he suggested that she rest and continue her training tomorrow. She sat down and took in her hands the books that lay near her feet and asked that food for her and Kanan be brought to her chambers. And the priest said as she wished. Seelie went to her room with a stack of books, and the priest stood and stared thoughtfully in her wake. His eyes radiated delight. He thought about the fact that they had barely started their training, and she was already using holy magic. It was amazing. She had only had a couple of days to master what ordinary people try to master for a lifetime. The servants of the temple also shared their impressions. One of them was delighted that the Lady Saint had healed his hands. Another said without a doubt that God himself had sent her to them. Priest Lennox watched her and thought that the magic of healing had come easier to her. He marveled again at her talent. She was walking down the corridor and it made her sick to her stomach to realize that she'd never seen a demon studying holy magic. And if the people of the underworld found out about it, they'd make a scene. However, she had to admit that until her powers returned to her, there was no more effective way. Holy energy is polar to demonic energy, so she's sure to put up a fight. She walked into the room and put the books on the table. Hall doesn't know she can use holy powers. Maybe she could catch him off guard. She took a seat on the couch next to her and opened the first book. The first thing she decided was that she owed it to herself to find a healing spell to cure Kanan's mum. And she thought in her heart of hearts, where the hell did Saint Reyna write it down? Bella was getting worse and worse every day, if she didn't find the spell in time. Seelie stopped and closed her eyes, saying she wasn't going to let her efforts go to waste. She would rather not fill her head with silly thoughts and concentrate on the book. Suddenly the door opened and Kanan came rushing into the room, followed by Verdie. They both shouted her name and rushed towards her. Verdie threw herself right at Seelie with the words that she believed Seelie. She really is a great saint sent by Ferdinand himself. She opened her tear-stained eyes and looked at Seelie, asking if she was hurt. And making sure that Seelie was all right, she snuggled up to her, wrapping her arms around her waist. Verdie thought that holy water her father had given her hadn't killed her, and now she knew for sure that Seelie was a great saint. Kanan, for his part, was tugging at her, trying to show her the picture he had drawn, and Seelie was trying to say she was busy. His drawing was of a girl with long black hair and red eyes, just like Seelie's, and she looked at the picture and said, "Is that a demon?" But Kanan said it was Seelie, and she smiled and said she was wrong, and she thought to herself that she wasn't wrong. Seelie took Kanan in her arms while she tried to pull Verdie away with her other hand, and asked how come they both came to her at the same time. Verdie looked at Seelie with awe and said, "Does the saint remember Verdie saying she couldn't wait to be her personal maid?" Well, she had finally been officially appointed to the position. And that's why she's here to help Seelie prepare for her appointment ceremony as a great saint, which is today. Verdie's voice was as excited as if she had been appointed to the position. She said it had been put off for a long time because the saint was always busy. She assured Seelie that she needn't worry. Verdie would help in any way she could. At that moment, there was a knock on the door, and everyone turned round to see who was there. It was the high priest. He apologized for disturbing her rest and said he had important news. Verdie got angry and said he was interrupting their fun, and Saley asked what was the matter. Saley looked hopefully into his eyes and said, "Did it really happen?" And the priest cheerfully blurted out that it was so, and asked how she had guessed it. They looked at each other in silence, holding back their glee and joy. Verdie looked at one and the other, not understanding what was going on, and then asked why they were looking at each other like that. And the high priest answered her question by saying that they had found a healing spell. Saley was cheering too. She was genuinely glad it was finally happening. Kanan came up to her and called out to her. The little one was anxious, and she leaned over and hugged him, trying to comfort him, saying that now his mum was sure to get better. She kissed the baby and said that everything would be all right now, and again she felt that long-forgotten feeling of happiness.